Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to learn how to create, delete, and modify local user accounts. Now, I'm logged into a linuxacademy.com lab server. I am operating as the root user. Now, first, what I want to do is I want to talk about a little bit of user conventions on a Red Hat Enterprise Linux system. For example, each user actually has an ID. So if you're at the command prompt, you can type ID, and what you'll see here is we have information about our specific user. For example, the user ID for the user, the primary group ID for the user, the supplementary groups for the specific user, and then of course our SE Linux context, and we're going to learn more about that in our security section of this Red Hat Enterprise Linux course. So that's what the ID command does. It returns information about the user you are logged in as. Now, a few things about that. You'll notice that the root user always has an ID of 0. Users that have an ID of 1 to 200, anywhere between 1 and 200, those are actually system users for specific Red Hat processes, for Red Hat file-owned processes. And then we have 201 to 999. Those are for system users that use system processes but don't own files on the system. So, for example, this would be if we installed Apache, and let's go ahead and demonstrate this. We'll do a yum install httpd. And if we were to go inside of our cat password file, and we could take a look at the most recent user added, which would be Apache, you'll notice that their user ID is actually 48. So what is the etc password file? Well, the etc password file lists all of the user accounts on our system and information associated with that user account. So, for example, this is our user account name. This represents our password field, but is linked to another file I'll show you in just one moment. This is our user ID. This is our primary group ID. This is an arbitrary field. We can put anything in here. A lot of times it is just the first name or last name of a user. Then we have the user's home directory, which for a regular user on the system is the directory that you can store files in or that you have when you first log in. And then the shell that the user has. So for example, on a regular user on the system would probably have bin bash. You'll notice, though, that there's sbin/no login. Well, when there is sbin/no login, that actually means that we're saying to the system, if this user tries to log into a shell, don't let it. We're not going to let it log in. So this is actually a kind of keyword that we should remember if we want to prevent a specific user from accessing a shell. Maybe the user needs access to something else on the system, but we don't want them to be able to SSH into the terminal. So that's a little bit about the structure of the password file. What is a primary group? Well, each user can have exactly one primary group. So whenever a user creates a new file or directory, the group owner of that file or directory will be that of the primary group that the user created. Now, a user can belong to supplementary groups, which means that the user can access folders and directories or applies the permissions, the same permissions as the supplementary groups. So for example, if we type groups root, we can see that the root user's primary group is root. So let's make this a little bit more simple. Let's do groups user. All right, so we see user. So the user, whenever we create a new user on the system, by default, it creates a new group. This group is going to be that user's name. And when we add the user to the group, it'll add supplementary groups. Now we're going to dive more and provide examples on this in our group lesson of part of this section in our Red Hat Enterprise Linux course. So let's get back to our user setup. I had mentioned here before that we have the X, which represents the password field. Well, that actually correlates with the etc shadow file. So if we notice here, we have the Apache user. Now, this etc shadow file has a lot of fields in it. We don't necessarily need to know each field associated with it. But what we see here is we see a password hash. This is a hash, or basically an encrypted password for the user. So this is the user's password. And when we change that user's password, it will change. Now, we'll dive more into this when we get into modifying user security permissions. Inside of this file, we'll store information like how long until the user is required to change their password. When does their password expire? The last time they changed their password. And we'll dive into that more as we get into that lesson. So in this lesson, now that we've kind of been introduced to the files a little bit, let's look at one more file, and then let's learn how to add users on the system, modify user information, change user password, and also remove users. So when we create that first user on the system, it's going to create an entry for that user. You'll notice Apache user has it on there. Our regular default user has it on there. Because currently it's configured, and we can change this configuration, but by default it's configured to automatically create a group and assign the user's primary group as their username that's created. So if we were to create a new user, and so let's dive into that. So we can do a user add. Now there's different fields and parameters we can pass the user add, and inside of the exam we may forget a flag, and that's okay. We can use user add -- help, or of course man user add, or even info user add to pull up that information. So we could say a user add, and we have these specific options. Do you want to create the user's home directory if the user's home directory does not exist? Now, by default, it is going to be inside of the cd/home directory. We can also say the user's home directory. We can specify a different directory rather than the defaults. We can pass a comment. This is our geckos field. This is our arbitrary field, which might store first name, last name information. The base directory for the home directory of the new account. The group ID for the primary group. So if you don't want it to add the primary group for the user as the user's name, we could specify different primary group. The skeleton directory. Now, by default, when you create a new user account, it's going to copy any file inside of the etc skell directory, right? So if we did an ls etc skell, any files inside of here would actually be copied from this directory into the user's new home account. So when might this be useful? Well, maybe you have readmes or instructions on what to use for new user accounts, and you want that to automatically exist inside of the user's directory when you create a new user. Now, because that's default though, we could specify a different skeleton directory. So for example, if you were going to create a new user that was in the accounting department, you might want to have specific template accounting documents copied over into that user's directory. But you don't want the accounting documents or templates for those documents copied over if it's a user in the IT department or a user in a different department, do you? And so we could actually specify as an option on the command line which skeleton directory to use. And this will override the default if we pass the default. We can override the etc login defs defaults, which we'll take a look at that later. Now we can go through each one of these, but we don't need to know each specific one, right? We have the help option. So our current one is going to be, do we want to assign a password for the user when we add it? There's multiple ways of doing that. But when we do this, we have to assign it or pass it an already encrypted password. We can use a tool like OpenSSL to do that. Is this going to be in a system account, which defines what type of user ID? Remember, a system account, since it's not a Red Hat system account, it's a system account that we would be creating, would have a user ID between 201 and 999. The type of shell we want them to use. And we're going to focus on the bash shell and leave that as the default as well. Do we want to specify the user ID or do we want it to automatically pull from the account? Then of course this is a flag that says create a group with the same name as the user. And again, I'll set it as the primary group. So what happens is we don't have to specify all of these flags. There's a set of defaults that are already created for this user. So for example, if we take a look at the etc login.defs file, we can see the set of defaults or some of the defaults that are already available. So for example, create a home directory, the UMask for the user, the password aging information for the user, the mail directory for the user. We also have another directory inside of etc, and it's actually called default. So if we go into the default directory, we see that there's a user add entry. So let's take a look at that user add entry. Now, user add entry says these are the defaults when adding a new user. This is the skeleton directory. I referred to the skeleton directory default. Well, we can change the defaults. The default shell, the default interactive, is it an interactive shell or not? So that's where the defaults come in at. So let's stop learning about what things are and let's learn how to create users. So I'm going to create a new user. I'm going to say user add Jeff. Now, when I did a user add Jeff, I'm going to go ahead and go into the Etsy home directory and look, it is configured to automatically create a user's home directory. But let's say I don't want to create a user's home directory. If we do user add -- help, we can take a look and specify a way not to create the user's home directory. So if we look here, do not create the user's home directory. So if we specify user add -- M, and I'm going to do my name Anthony, and then we do an ls in the user's home directory, and we look that there's not a directory named Anthony. But if we take a look in the password file and we grep for Anthony, that user exists. So the user having a home directory is not dependent on the user having access to the system. However, when the user logs in, it's not going to work quite the same because inside the user's home directory, for example, if we go into Jeff, we have specific bash configurations, right? So if we take a look at our bash configurations file, we'll see that there's information like the local path, specific environment for our startup programs. So we created these users. We chose not to pass the user a password on the command line. So how can we change the user's password? Well, there's a command for that, and it's called passwd. So you just type passwd and you specify the user's password you want to change. You enter in the new password, and then it allows us to update the password for that user. So now that we have that user on the system, we can go log into the system. The reason we can log into the system is because when we look for that specific user, you'll notice it doesn't say /sbin no login. It actually specifies the bash shell that the user is going to use when they log in. Now, if we take a look at our shadow file and we grep for the user Anthony, here's our password hash. If I were to change the password for the Anthony user to a different password and we were to take a look at that password hash, does it match? No, because this is our hash. This is the hash for the specific encrypted password, and we've changed that. So after a user's been created, maybe we need to modify some user information. Now, let's say we don't remember what we need to do. So we can do a user mod -- help. This gives us our options inside of an exam or production environment. This is very useful. There's a lot of options and flags for us to remember. So we can change the comment, create a new home directory for the user. We'll cover expiration, password information as part of our security lesson in this section. We can change the primary group of a user. We can add supplementary groups for that individual user. We can provide a new login name. We can lock the user account, which actually prevents or changes the user's password hash so they can't log in. So let's clear our screen here and start again. I'm going to create a new password for Jeff. Then let's take a look and we'll do a cat on the Etsy shadow file because that's where our password is stored. We'll grep for the user Jeff. We'll see that we have a hash there, right? So now let's lock the user by using user mod. We're going to modify it. We're going to lock the user. We're going to lock the user Jeff. If we go back up and we look at Jeff, we notice there's an exclamation point in front of the hash. This locks the user, prevents the user from logging in and out of the system with the user's username and password. So how do we undo this? Well, we can do a user mod --U for the user Jeff, and we'll look at his password hash and notice the exclamation point's no longer there. So it basically changes the user's password so they can't log into the system, right? So now that we've had that, let's say that we want to look at Jeff's user ID. We'll do ID Jeff. Just by typing ID one time shows our ID information of the currently logged in user you're working as. So you'll see Jeff has a user ID of 1005. Well, I want to reclassify this user's ID to be 1010. So we could do a user mod -U for user ID, and and we'll specify the user's ID and then the user's name we want to apply it to. Now we'll do ID Jeff. We'll notice that Jeff is now 1010. Now we can also modify the geckos field by using a user mod -c, or again, if we're not sure, we can do --help. And we see that we can modify the geckos field by using a user mod -c, changing it to Jeff is the user's first name, and we're applying that to the user Jeff. So now if we do a cat on the Etsy password file where that user information is stored, and we do a grep for Jeff, we see that the user's first name or password field, or what's called the geckos field, is Jeff. If we want to add another user, we could say user add --help, and maybe we want to specify something different here. Maybe we want to specify the user's home directory to be a little bit different. So how would we do that? Well, we could say user add --help. Again, that shows us everything we need to have. It's good practice to know how to look for what options are available during the exam. So we could do a user add, and then we could specify, well, the user ID that we wanted the user to have. We could say 1050 if we wanted. If we wanted to specify a specific user's home directory, we could say -d. So for example, we're going to create a user named Mary, and I want her home directory to be Mary1 instead of just Mary, which would be the default based off of our defaults when we're creating it. And then I could go ahead and just specify the username that we're going to create. First, let's take a look if it correctly created the user. So we'll look in the cat Etsy password. It should be our last one there. We see that we have Mary, the user ID of 1050, and /home/Mary1. So let's say, well, I really wanted Mary to be a member of the wheel group. So I could just do a user mod -g and then specify wheel for Mary. And if we say groups Mary, we see that Mary is a member of the wheel group. So let's take a look at removing the users. Now, if I back out of one directory, we see that we have the user's home directory, Jeff, Mary1, and user. Now remember, we also added the user Anthony on the system, but that user didn't have a home directory. He only had entries inside of the Etsy password and shadow files. Now, when we delete a user's home directory, we can also use the --help option to view available options and flags. -r is the one we're going to focus on here because -r allows us to remove the user's home directory and also allows us to remove the user's mail spool. So when might we not want to remove the user's home directory? Well, let's say there's files inside of that user's home directory that haven't been migrated yet. We don't want to remove those off of the system. So let's go ahead and just do user del Anthony, and we'll delete the user Anthony. He didn't have a home directory, so we didn't have to worry about deleting it. To delete the home directories for Jeff, we would use user del -r Jeff. And then the same thing for Mary, user del -r Mary. We'll do an ls, and we'll notice those users are off the system. If we do a cat on the Etsy password file, we'll notice those users are off the system, and the same thing for the shadow file. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson.